Gradients are a relatively new addition to VectorDrawable and are now also included within the support library version. Here is a simple VectorDrawable with a solid fill. If we want to use a gradient fill instead, we can either specify a gradient resource instead of the hex value within the fill color attribute, or we can use an inline XML resource to define a gradient inline. We can do this by replacing the fill color attribute with an inline one. Inside this, we define the gradient, and this takes the form of a gradient resource, which is different to the resource which we would use to define a gradient within a shape drawable. To start with, we'll create a linear gradient, which requires us to define start and end points, along with the associated colors for each. When the gradient is rendered, the transition will occur along an imaginary line between the start and end points, and the color will gradually transform from the start color to the end color the further along this line we travel. Any points within the region that do not lie on this line will be colored according to the color of the closest point of the line. So all the pixels in a perpendicular plane to any given point on the line will be colored the same as that point. In this case, the start point is the top left corner and the end point is the top right corner, so we get a horizontal gradient. If we change the end position to be the bottom right corner instead, then we get a diagonal gradient. The warnings that we're seeing here can safely be ignored because Android Studio has not yet been updated to recognize that these attributes are now supported earlier than API 24 thanks to their inclusion in the support library version of VectorDrawable. The next kind of gradient is a radial gradient, for which we must define a center point. In this case, it is the center of our path, and we then give it a radius. The gradient will begin at the center point with the start color and transition to the end color as we move away from the center point until we reach a distance equal to the radius from the center point. All points which are the same distance from the center will have the same color. The third kind of gradient is a sweep gradient. This will start at the start color and transition to the end color as the angle from the start position changes. The preview in Android Studio has a rendering bug with sweep gradients, where the center point is actually offset. If we run this on an actual device, we can see that the gradient is perfectly centered within the path. If we need to change this angle, we can apply a rotation to the parent group of the path. Here we can rotate it by 90 degrees anti-clockwise, and we'll see the appropriate rotation on the sweep gradient when we run it. Gradients are not limited to simple start and end colors. We can include intermediate color stops as well. To do this, we create a series of items, each of which represents a separate color stop. The offset is a float value between 0 and 1, which specifies which position in the gradient the color will be used. An offset of 0 represents the start color, and an offset of 1 represents the end color. In this case, the start and end colors are the same, and we can define an alternate color at the halfway point using offset 0.5, and we'll get a radial gradient which starts at one color, transitions to the second color at the midpoint, and then transitions back to the original color.